Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Professor. Let me start by thanking CIRS for inviting me to speak this evening. I haven't been to Qatar for many, many years, actually longer than I want to mention. It's embarrassing diplomatically and also reflects on how old I am. But I'm very glad to be here. This is a prestigious event and a prestigious venue. And I think also it's an important time to discuss both what's happening in America and also what's happening in the Arab world and see how we can move forward on this. In order to discuss challenges that America and the Middle East face, what can be done between the United States and our part of the world, I think it's important to take a step back and look at what's happening in America and what's happening in the Arab world, and then apply that to politics and issues of foreign affairs. First of all, I think that in America, as is the case for the Arab world, the United States is actually going through a transformational change. And it has not yet completed that change. And that's why you see policies that tend to be grand, be they grand in their success or, frankly, big in their failures. And what I mean by this is that, and I'm actually born in America. I'm not an American. For years, America looked at itself and still calls itself as a continent. They, given their size, given their wealth, given their strength, looked at themselves as a continent, found their security inwards rather than outwards. And of course, part of that is that they're surrounded by oceans, at least for most of the parts of America. In dealing with foreign policy, and that was never a topical issue for the average American, they only dealt with foreign policy in big issues, equal to their size and equal to something that can attract the attention of the New Yorker, the guy from Arkansas, and somebody on the West Coast. It wasn't about sub-regional problems in Africa. It was about global issues. US-USSR relations, for example, was something that would attract attention in America. With the end of the Cold War, and also at the same time globalization, things were changing. America is still used to looking at the world in terms of being a superpower. I went around America over the last 2 years before I left, arguing that you don't realize you're not a superpower anymore. You're actually a global power. And what I mean by this is that a superpower is basically a function of strength. And you consequently sell foreign policy to the average American in terms of being able to extend your influence globally or defend against a large fear factor. A global power is different. Global power means that you have tremendous opportunity throughout the world, far greater than Egypt, Qatar, or any small or medium-sized country. At the same time, you have responsibilities around the world that you would not have as a global power. And this is a much more subtle, complex sell for foreign policy to the average American. To explain your responsibilities and your opportunities to the average American, you have to actually engage him in understanding what the countries of Africa are, what exists in Asia, and so on and so forth. And you also have to explain to him the responsibilities that his actions have on the global arena. And just most recently, if we take the financial crisis as an example, the financial crisis was, quote unquote, made in America. That's essentially where the problems started. Not only, but that's where it started. And because they emerged in America, even though our part of the world was not engaged in it, of course, the effects went far beyond the US continent. If you look at the figures for foreign investment in the Arab world, 2008 versus 2007, you will see that there is a reduction of $10 billion in foreign investment in the Arab world. Between 2008, it is $65 billion in comparison to $75 billion in 2007. And this is a UN UNCTAD report. This is a function, essentially, of the financial crisis and different oil prices. The transformation in America, you could see signs of it during President Clinton's era. President Clinton was an internationalist. He wanted to deal with the world multilaterally as well as bilaterally. He tried to support the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. He tried to help negotiate an environmental treaty, the Kyoto Treaty, with climate change, but he could not get either of them through the Senate and through Congress because, again, the body politic in America had not transformed itself yet from being a global superpower to being a global power. Regrettably, during President Bush's tenure, President Bush came in basically not wanting to be the world's policeman, as he had originally said, not wanting to engage into nation building, as he originally said. But during President Bush's tenure, we had the horrendous 9/11 events. And of course, the reaction, therefore, in America was that the world is coming to us with negative consequences rather than positive consequences. So the first reaction to globalization is it's actually a threat to us rather than an opportunity. And understandably, to a point, not completely, but to a point, the President Bush's reaction was, I want to secure America, and he consequently sold his foreign policy to Americans as a function of fears, of threats from abroad that they have to deal with, and deal with them abroad, not as a function of opportunities and challenges. What you saw, consequently, was further American unilateralism, withdrawal from the world. None of the multilateral treaties were negotiated during President Bush's tenure or sanctioned. The Middle East peace process, their participation in it was minimal to a great degree up until the last 2 years of President Bush's second tenure in office. And ultimately, the Iraqi experience was either you join America or you're wrong. And they, rather than use the UN formats, they used coalitions of the willing to deal with Iraq. And finally, of course, the general theme of war against terror. Now, I'm not much for sloganeering and debates like that, but if you're trying to sell an argument to the American layman, concepts like the war against terror that are simple, frankly, I think destructive concepts, are easily sellable. So selling globalization as a function of fear was quite evident during President Bush's tenure. Again, part of it because he was not internationalist, but part of it also because of 9/11 and what happened. The last American presidential campaign, strangely enough, was about change from both candidates. President Obama argued change, one, because he was different. If he didn't argue that, he wasn't going to be elected. Secondly, he was young, so he was not associated with the foreign policies not only of President Bush, but of a generation of American presidents. And thirdly, because he was committed to it. Now, I don't mean that that's the level of commitment, but those are the three factors. Candidate McCain, who is a conservative, traditional candidate, also argued change. The difference between the two was McCain argued we need to be more effective, we need to change and become more effective in dealing with threats that are coming from abroad. In other words, do a more effective job than Bush did. Obama wanted Americans to become more optimistic, more self-confident in themselves, engage in the world. In other words, he was not selling fear as the element. He was actually selling that America can do this, believe in yourself, and go out and engage the world. In his inaugural speech, it is noteworthy that if you read the speech carefully, his first demand was of Americans, that they need to change themselves. They need to move away from the excesses that exist in the American economy if they're going to invest in the future and solve their economy. And then he called upon them, of course, to engage with the world as an American national security interest, to understand the world better, and he focused to a great degree on the role of diplomacy as his first rule in dealing with international relations. Since his election, you've actually seen him very active diplomatically, be that in how he's dealing with the financial crisis with the G8, be that in not using the terms war against terror, that is not used by the administration, even though they are, of course, working against terrorism, in his call for a new relationship with the Muslim world based on mutual respect, and of course, in his appointment of a number of special representatives, of emissaries, to deal with the specific or hot crises around the world. Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East peace process, the Korean process. Each one of these, he's appointed a special emissary to go and engage. These reflect a new approach. Often people wonder, why do we spend so much time analyzing America? And as a foreigner, as an Egyptian diplomat, do I have the right to do that? Whether I have the right to or not, I do it. And I will do it, because what happens in America affects the whole world. So what they do will have consequences in my part of the world, and therefore I'm not only obliged, I have a responsibility to analyze what's happening in America. I can't vote in their elections, but hypothetically speaking, there may be some logic to that as well. But if you look at how much public support and sentiment occurred internationally for President Obama's election, it gives you two indications. One, that everybody is following what's happening in America because of the reasons I mentioned. And two, given that they were happy with his message, that the world actually wants to engage America, that the world understands that we are all interdependent. So that you don't think I'm a dreamy-eyed optimist, I can tell you that 2-3 years from now, we will probably be disappointed with President Obama. Not because he will fail, but because expectations are so high. It's almost impossible for me, at least, to imagine that he will achieve all those goals on all those issues for everybody. So somebody's going to be disappointed. However, I am really impressed by his desire to take on critical, sensitive issues and to try to achieve major goals. He's not a micro president. So far, at least, he's talking about macro issues. The idea of trying to say, I'm going to get rid of nuclear deterrence and go towards a nuclear zero for a first-time president is quite astonishing. The way he's attempted to deal with the financial crisis also is impressive. And also the same applies on a number of Middle East issues, which I will deal with. Now, I've talked about America. The Arab world is also going through a transformation. And that's important. It's going through transformation. Whether or not it happens in America, we are going through our own transformation. On the one hand, we have traditionally conservative societies, socially. And these societies are being challenged by an increased openness from the media. An openness that brings in ideas that are not necessarily those that we share. It brings in ideas that challenge, that we may not actually understand. and it brings in ideas that frankly come from all over the world. They influence our own domestic debate. And more, that's going to affect our customs and our traditions. Secondly, I would add that with all of these ideas, the increased presence of foreign nationals in our societies, be that by increased tourism, and I'm talking about all of the Arab world, not only the Gulf area, be that through increased tourism, or even an increased longer presence. I'll give you an example. This is not large, given that Egypt is so highly populated, but we actually have a large increase in the number of residency permits of Europeans and Russians, in particular in the Red Sea coast of Egypt. And of course, if you look at the Arabian Gulf area, you find a large number of foreign nationals. The ideas coming in and the presence of these people, and they are a positive contribution, not a negative one. They are a positive contribution. Ultimately will also affect our traditions and our norms. Also are part of the transformation process that we are going through. And thirdly, demographics. Again, using my own country as the example. Egypt has about 80 million people today. That's a quarter of the Middle East. Now, the reason I give it is I'm an Egyptian diplomat, but it's also the correct example to give because it actually has a quarter of the Middle East. 56% of our population is 25 years or younger. I have a 2-year-old grandson whom I phoned a few days ago. And, of course, he got bored with his grandfather 10 seconds after I phoned. So he said, "Grandpa, I'll put you on speaker." Frankly, I was shocked. He wanted to play, but he understood that he could play and listen to me at the same time by pushing a button. Now, frankly, I would never have thought of doing that, but this is a younger generation. They think differently. They're connected to everything around the world. They get their information around the world. My son is the same. He brings in and asks me questions about things that, frankly, I have no idea what he's talking about because it's not only a function of what he can reach. It's a function of how he can reach out. Well, we're going to have to deal with that in our own societies, that our children may actually know more than us. They won't be wiser than us, but they may be able to get more information more quickly. And for conservative societies, it's not easy to do, but that's what's happening in our part of the region. I want to add also that this is happening in our region, and people are outside the region are following it carefully because they understand that what happens in the Middle East does affect them. It's not only restricted to the Middle East. Same applies, of course, anywhere around the world, but my target today is the Middle East. I mentioned the issue of 9/11 as one example. 9/11, while the perpetrators came from the Middle East, they were actually training in Afghanistan, networking in Europe, and targeting North America. So if that gives you an example of the global context of any problem, it's a chilling one, but it is one. The other thing is immigration. Depending on the economies, it depends whether the Middle East is drawing in immigrants or sending them out. And if you look at the Mediterranean, you see this debate between the south and the north of the Mediterranean. Trade and security of trade. When terrorism occurred, when the war in Afghanistan occurred, our insurance rates in Egyptian ports went up 170%. Even though they were Egyptian ports, nothing to do with Afghanistan, but anything Middle Eastern was considered to be security conscious if you're sending to America. And recently, pandemics, whether it's the bird flu or swine flu, anything that happens today is followed. So what's happening here is of interest to us, but it's also of interest around the world because more and more the world is interdependent. And I would argue 2 points. As we move forward, you will see a continued, 2 points about the Middle East, a continued importance for traditional states, or excuse me, states that have traditionally played a leading role in the Middle East. I mentioned my own country because of demographics, because the political, economic, and social trends, given demographics, always have a strong foothold into Egypt and always, not always, but very frequently, start from that region. So if you're going to follow the region, you're going to follow that particular country. If you're looking at traditional diplomacy to deal with conflict areas, again, that's another example where you'd have traditional states. And whether it applies to politics, economics, or social issues. I would also add that the movement of wealth and energy demands will lead to increased importance, in parallel to that, of the Arab Gulf area. And that's going to be a plus or a negative. It's going to be a plus if the Arab Gulf and the wealthier countries in the Arab world are able to appropriately and in a well-diversified manner expand their investments and gain a sense of control of in the investments that they put around the world, so that as their wealth increases, their decision-making ability in these entities increases, rather than that investment becoming an increased burden upon them if their investments are not well diversified, or if it doesn't bring a degree of control, and yet their investments are out there in the hands of other countries. So one way or the other, there's going to be an increased importance. The energy factor is the same thing, with the demands on the emerging markets in particular, be that China or India. Energy demands will increase. How we deal with that is going to be going to affect the results, but they will be different. If we don't deal with it properly, you will have a lot of problems. If you deal with it properly, you will gain further influence. I mentioned these two things. I promise you I will get to the Palestinian issue, but in a while. I mentioned these two things because, frankly, if the Arab world is to have influence on America and influence on the rest of the world, we have to be able to work together. We can't have simply the right policies. We can't simply have wealth. We have to have the right policies, the ability to work diplomatically, in other words, to have the traditional value, the traditional role, and also to have the wealth. If you don't have size and if you want the historical foundation, you will not be able to compete with large marketplaces abroad or large political entities that exist abroad. Now, I say this as a diplomat, and I know somebody's going to come up and say, well, what happened with the Arab world and all that? What happened recently, especially in terms of the last few months, the last few years, is in all honesty a tragedy. And I think it's going to be detrimental. It is detrimental to the Arab world, and it needs to be resolved in a balanced, realistic, practical manner. We don't have to agree on anything. On some things, sure. We don't have to agree on everything. But we have to understand how to disagree with each other. The Europeans, for example, they don't agree on everything. They actually have less in common than we do. But when they disagree, and they are vocal about these disagreements, by the way, when they disagree, they don't cross the lines of accusing the other side of being less nationalistic, less patriotic, less this or less that, and they don't work against each other. They have a legitimate disagreement which is public and open, which is fine. But there are limits to what they do against each other because the overall context of their interest is to work together even if they disagree on occasion. And I would hope we get there because frankly, if not, we will not be able to compete. I would also add before moving into the more mundane part of my presentation, I would also add that if the Arab world is going to have an effect on world affairs, it has to be more proactive. It cannot be reactive to an international agenda set by others. We have to go out there and make our case on political issues, on economic issues, and on social issues. Go out, make the case, argue the case with vigor, make your voice heard. If you get incremental success, it will be better than reacting to an international agenda, which is not meant to be negative towards you. But since you're not explaining your societal values, since you're not explaining your religion, how do you want people to know it? Why should they take you into account if all you're doing is saying, well, I reject what you're offering? It's too late when most of the world has agreed on a trend, and we come back and say, well, we don't agree to this. So more and more, we need to be more proactive in what we put forward. That, of course, requires that we become more value-added and allow our societies to move forward and take our traditions as the foundation for development, not as a limitation on what we can do. Nor should we try to be something we are not. I am not a proponent of those arguing that we need to drop our traditions and become the West. It won't succeed, and I don't support that. But I am also a proponent of let's take our traditions as the foundation. It does not stop us from thinking and building on them, how to be part of the modern world based on those concepts. That's really what I think we need to focus on. Now, I spent quite a long time on trying to explain change in America and in the Arab world and what we need to do because all the concrete issues that I will mention very quickly have to be solved in that context, and these issues will come and go, but the macro challenges will not. Let's, if you allow me now, to dwell on foreign policy per se, and particularly where I see the administration going and where I see the Arab world going, mostly on the Middle East issues. If you look at President Obama's priorities as announced on foreign policy, with respect to the Middle East, because this is a global power, so I'm talking here only about the Middle East. In essence, his foreign policy's priorities are reduce my forces in Iraq, increase my effectiveness in Afghanistan, deal with Iran, trying to find a solution, and if not, we'll see what happens. Secure the world and America against violence, in other words, against terror, without using the war against terror as a theme, and deal with the Middle East peace process, the Arab-Israeli peace process. The Arab world's priority of issues in the Middle East are the Middle East peace process, Iran, trying to determine whether Iran is a threat to the Middle East and not, and if so, how, or how to deal with it in a constructive sense, stabilizing Iraq, dealing with our own problems about terrorism, and of course, Afghanistan. Now, again, I can add other names, and I can tell you that my personal priority has nothing to do with foreign policy, but I'm talking here about foreign policy. This sequence that I gave you is not the same on both sides. But I'm not that worried. One, because worrying won't help me. It's doing something about it that makes the difference. But more so, because President Obama has actually said that while these are his priorities, he believes that all of these issues in one region are interconnected. In other words, if there's movement on Iraq, it helps Afghanistan. If there's movement on Afghanistan, it helps Iraq. If there's movement on the Arab-Israeli conflict, it helps dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan. Not in terms of one problem solves the other, but if you want to develop regional consensus to work together, then you have to respond to the priorities and concerns of the different parties. In other words, to get the Arab world to be more proactive in dealing with the Iraq issue or with terrorism or with this or with that, frankly, it's very useful if they can move, they can find some progress on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the opposite also is true. So what I'm saying here is that he has actually argued that all of these issues are interconnected. So irrespective of the priorities, they're all on the table. And that's where we have to play a more important role. He has offered an opportunity, not a solution. And again, domestic American politics will prevail. Don't think this is going to be solved by right and wrong. It's going to be solved by practical, cynical politics. And at the end of the day, President Obama is an American politician. That's who he is. Cost-benefit analysis of what he should do and not is the name of the game. But he is proactive, he is engaged on the issues, and he wants to deal with all these issues together. Our position, and I say this from my own experience, we need to be straightforward, clear, and concise with America. We have to put forward clearly what we can do, what we need done, and put it in short terms. I mean, explaining the history of the Middle East every time is not going to help convince anybody. It's what they can do in the short term. On the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I'm going to run through these issues, and I promise to finish within 2 hours. On the Middle East issue, there's not going to be a solution where there's going to be peace between the Arabs and Israel any time in my lifetime. That's not going to be based on the two-state solution, where there is another Palestinian state besides Israel, a Palestinian state that has a capital in Jerusalem, that has its borders based on the 1967 border. If there are minor exchanges of territory, it will be done by mutual agreement and in a fashion that does not conflict with the principle of not acquiring territory by force. The refugee problem will fundamentally include the principle of right of return, but the application of realistic practical measures on how many return where and who is compensated and so on and so forth. And the issue of security will, I assume, prevent surprise attack against Israel from the Palestinian territories, but I would argue require also that the Palestinian territories be secured against any surprise attack, because the debate so far has only been about Israel's security, not about the Palestinian security. Now, you will tell me, well, we've heard that before. I know. We've been trying for a long time. That's why you've heard it before. If we go for a one-state solution, I don't see peace in the near term. So, as a practical diplomat, I'm looking at it as a two-state solution. Frankly, when Prime Minister Netanyahu goes to America, we want President Bush to indicate to him that the two-state solution... I'm sorry, Obama. I'm sorry. I'm glad that you mentioned. President Obama. Well, actually, I was thinking of the father, but anyway. President Obama, he's asked for permanent settlement. He's asked for negotiations. He's concerned about settlements. So we'll see when the Israeli Prime Minister goes there, and also President Abu Mazen is going to go, and of course President Mubarak and King Abdullah of Jordan has already been there. On the issue of Iraq, Iraq for us has to remain a unified country, How they ultimately govern is something for the Iraqis to decide, but it has to be a unified country where Iraqis choose their Iraqi identity before their ethnic identity. It's going to be a difficult process because there's so much historical baggage and pain that exists, but we need to work with Iraqis and with the international community to ensure that this happens, that there is no lapse in security as the Americans withdraw, and that there is a process of political inclusion to ensure that when disagreements occur, they're not resolved by violence thereafter. On the issue of terrorism, look, we were in Egypt, were the targets of terrorists before Americans were the targets of terrorism. So we're not on opposite sides of the argument here, and many of us in the Middle East have also been the targets of terrorism. This debate is not about one culture, one civilization against the other. It's about a trend that regrettably exists in the Middle East more than it exists in other areas now. But for our Western friends in the room here, don't get too proud of yourselves. There was terrorism in Europe in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. They weren't Muslim, by the way. The Red Army in Italy, Badr Meinhof in Germany, ETA in Spain. I can take it all the way to Japan and the Syrian attacks. These were not Middle Easterners. They were not Muslim. They weren't from poor countries. And they were from democratic countries. So the idea that any one element is the function of terrorism, or that this is a function of Islam, is just complete heresy. And it's not going to be resolved by putting the blame on the other. We cannot live in self-denial. We have a problem. But you cannot live or succeed if you're going to put the blame on others, because you've been there before. And that's why, while we should make the same argument to President Obama, so far he's been quite correct in changing the arguments in America about this. Now, I'm actually on time. As we move forward, in America there will be a debate about what Obama should do early in his tenure and what he should postpone to later. And what we need to do is, in making our case to America, make it clear that we're making this case because it serves our national interest. That we will do this, whether America pursues it or not. This is not a request that we're making to America that if they don't do it, then we will not continue to pursue our own objectives. I think we would be relinquishing our own sovereignty if we did that. At the same time, and let me mention, by the way, there is not a single Arab-Israeli agreement that was signed that started in America. Every single one either started in the Middle East or passed by Egypt in one form or the other, as a location, as a broker, as whatever you want to call it. The only exception was the Shepherdstown Agreement between the Palestinians and Prime Minister Netanyahu, which broke down within 2 months and was re-signed in Sharm el-Sheikh again. Now, having said that, there is not a single Arab-Israeli agreement, not a single one, that was concluded without America. In other words, we started because it serves our interest, but we can't conclude it unless America plays its role because of its weight with the two sides. America has to understand that its role is instrumental in achieving these objectives. But it's not doing us a favor, because if you're living in a global society, then you have to understand that if you have frustration, inequity, poverty, and I can go on to a long list of issues, if you have those in one region, they will ultimately come back and bite you in the face. Problems in America affect the Middle East. problems in the Middle East will affect America's national interest. It is extremely important, and I credit President Obama for this. He has often said that words matter. Words have an effect. So it's extremely important to follow what he's saying and what he's not saying, and hold him accountable for what he's saying and what he's not saying. What's interesting is that in talking about the Middle East peace process recently, he said the Middle East peace process, the achievement of peace in the Middle East, is in America's national interest. In the past, the argument was always, well, we're doing this to make Israel more secure or to make our friendly allies more secure. He once again, and this has not been used since President Bush the father, he once again started to say, it's in America's national interest that I need to pursue peace in the Middle East. If you use that argument, you can sell to the American people why he has to put political assets out there, why he has to take risks out there, and why he has to put America's economic force and that of the developed countries in supporting a peace agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, for your time. I'd love to spend some time on issues of nonproliferation and nuclear disarmament, but that's a very long topic, and there would be no reason to invite me back again if I did spend too much time on that. So let me close with those comments and give you a chance to question me, criticize me. Ask any question you want, by the way, not only about what I discussed. As I've said, and of course I'm an Egyptian. I was born in America, so if you're looking at a Middle Easterner with a New York background, I'm thick-skinned. Don't worry about your question, but you will also get a very blunt answer if I don't like the question. Thank you.